Discoveries, new favorites, first time watches, whatever you want to call them, these are my top 10 movie discoveries of 2023. How's it going, my friends? Welcome again to the Cobwebs channel. My name is Daniel, and the point of this channel has always been to discuss cinema of the past. And I have talked to you about so many old movies over the past year, and this is the video where I want to tell you what are my very favorites. There's only 2 points of criteria to a movie getting to make this list, and number one is it has to be a movie I had never seen before 2023. And number two, it has to be a movie that is not a new release. This is not a video talking about the best movies of the past year, just the best older movies that I watched for the first time last year. In fact, we are not even going to get any more modern than the 1990s, not even dipping into the 2000s. This video is all about talking about those older gems. And I also want to give a shout out to the Film Feast podcast. I actually guested on an episode recently talking about my top 10 discoveries. So if you want to hear me talk about these movies longer with a couple other people and also get to hear those other co-host lists as well, definitely check it out. Although I am going to warn you, this list is a little different because I recorded that in mid-November and I've seen more movies since then. Speaking of the more movies I've seen, let's kick this list off with my number 10, which is a 1973 Paul Naschy horror film, Hunchback of the Morgue. So in this film, Paul Naschy stars as a poor, sad hunchback who is deeply in love with a very sick woman who is terminally in the hospital. He goes to visit her regularly, and because he's the only one who visits her anymore because she's so sick, she grows to appreciate him very much as well. But inevitably, she does end up passing away, and this pushes the hunchback over the edge. He goes on a murder spree, but then ends up connecting with a mad scientist who claims he can bring the hunchback's love back from the dead. So I checked this movie out on Scream Factory's Paul Naschy Collection Volume 2, and gosh, I loved it so much. My regular viewers know that I have been getting really into Paul Naschy movies over the past year, a Spanish filmmaker and actor who made a bunch of horror films in the 60s, 70s, and 80s most predominantly. And all of the ones I've seen, I think this one might so far be my very favorite. First of all, Paul Naschy gives a fantastic performance as this hunchback. He really is sympathetic, and even when he's doing undeniably horrible things, you still kind of like him. I also loved how the movie just kept changing what it was. Now, this is not an adaptation of the classic Hunchback of Notre Dame story by any means, although it does carry over some of those unrequited love, romantic themes. But after his love dies, this almost becomes like a hyper-violent, giallo murder kind of a movie. This probably is the goriest Paul Naschy movie that I have seen yet. And then when that mad scientist comes in, it definitely becomes a Frankenstein movie with the hunchback as the lead, which was a really cool direction to go. But it definitely does not have your typical Frankenstein monster by any means. What he ends up creating is something very different, original, and really gross. And the movie wisely holds that reveal back for a long time, but really builds anticipation well. And once you get to it, it is satisfying, disgusting, creepy. I really appreciated that. So this movie is just an awesome movie with characters you sympathize for, with gory murder, and with interesting twists on typical Gothic horror themes. Now let's dramatically switch things up with my number 9, which is a classic Michael Curtiz film, Mildred Pierce from 1945. So this movie stars Joan Crawford as Mildred Pierce, who separates from her husband at the beginning of the movie, and all she wants is to provide a good life for her daughter on her own. She starts out just working at a restaurant, but quickly discovers she's really good at this and thinks she can own her own restaurant. So she does that and becomes a true business tycoon, incredibly successful in the restaurant business. The movie turns into a romance for a bit, but definitely turns into a noir at a certain point when a murder occurs and you don't know what happened. Did Mildred Pierce do it? If so, why? The movie has a lot of good mystery going on. I checked this movie out before I made a video this year on my favorite movie of every year of the 1940s, and this did end up becoming my favorite movie of 1945. I thought it was awesome, a classic for a reason. This is a time in cinema's history when a melodrama could be just electric, crackling entertainment. That doesn't really happen anymore. I don't watch a ton of dramas, to be honest with you. And this one is just wildly entertaining. I mean, the actors are so good. Joan Crawford's amazing in this. She did this movie at a bit of a downturn in her career, and it was a huge comeback for her. She ended up winning an Oscar for this movie, and it's got a great supporting cast around her as well, particularly Anne Blythe as her daughter, the worst daughter in the world. She just very well plays one of the most unlikable characters you have ever seen in your entire life. But not just the actors, like the dialogue is so good in this movie. Like they really just got amazing material to work with. The dialogue is just so snappy, witty, crackling. I just absolutely loved it. Not just some classic black and white drama, like it is super entertaining. I really just can't say that enough. My number 8 is an awesome courtroom drama, Anatomy of a Murder from 1959. So this Otto Preminger film stars Jimmy Stewart as a small-time Michigan lawyer who gets hired to defend a man in a murder case. The movie is not about did he do it, because we know he did it right from the start. He confesses right away. But this movie is about why did he do it and was it excusable or not. In this almost 3-hour courtroom drama, this movie takes you through a very realistic look at what a murder trial actually is like. This is actually based on a book that was based on a real trial, and it fascinatingly takes us through the process as the defense attorney, Jimmy Stewart, tries to frame the events leading up to this murder as horrible as possible, and the prosecution tries to frame it as not actually that bad and certainly not justifiable of murder. I checked this movie out on my Criterion Blu-ray, and that's what I found so fascinating about this movie is, unlike a lot of other courtroom dramas, it's not about what happened. It's about why did it happen. And that's just very realistic. It's just all about watching these lawyers try to frame the story in their own ways. I have a friend who's a lawyer, and he told me that when you're a defense lawyer, you don't even really want to know if your client did it or not. Like, that's not the concern. The concern is establishing doubt, establishing sympathy for your client, and watching Jimmy Stewart go through that process is just absolutely fascinating. This film's also got an amazing supporting cast all around Jimmy Stewart, but he is definitely just the rock solid lead of this movie. And also the film's just got like jazz music going all throughout it, both as the score and because Jimmy Stewart is just a big jazz fan. His character is, that is. And as my final word of endorsement, because this movie is almost 3 hours long, I put it on one night with absolutely no intention to finish it. I didn't have time before I like going to bed at night. And I found this movie impossible to turn off. I planned on watching it in 2 nights. I could not do that. I stayed up late because this movie is just too good to leave for even a minute. Okay, we've got another classic drama at number 7. This is Douglas Sirk's There's Always Tomorrow from 1956. There's Always Tomorrow stars Fred MacMurray as a typical family man in the 1950s. He's got a great wife, he's got great kids, he's got a great job, house in the suburbs, but he's not happy. In fact, he's lonely because his family is all so busy that he's really just not getting a lot of attention from them, even from his wife. He reconnects with an old coworker who comes into town, played by Barbara Stanwyck, and quickly comes to the decision that he wants to have an affair. I checked this movie out on the Criterion channel, but it is available on Blu-ray from Kino Lorber. And this movie is an incredibly honest and empathetic look at an extramarital affair. It's not necessarily about the question of is it right, is it wrong, but why would it happen? What would lead to this? And I loved how the movie just was really empathetic to everyone involved. You understood why Fred MacMurray was lonely and unsatisfied. You understood why this put Barbara Stanwyck in a very uncomfortable position and she doesn't know what to do. You understand why his wife is just busy with things and just not really paying attention to what's in front of her. Douglas Sirk has become one of my favorite directors. I think he makes amazing melodramas. He made a lot of movies back in the day that were called women's pictures. They were just incredibly thoughtful and emotional looks at what women went through back in this time period. But this movie does all of that, but for the man, for Fred MacMurray. And he gives a brilliant performance. Everybody does. And while Douglas Sirk movies are normally gorgeous color movies, this is black and white, and Sirk does everything for black and white that he normally does for color. Just one of the most gorgeous movies I've ever seen. The use of shadow in that black and white photography is stunning. All right, let's get away from those classy movies, and at my number 6, talk about one of the most sick, twisted, and disturbing things I saw all year. This is Blood for Dracula from 1974. Udo Kier stars as the iconic Count Dracula, Dracula, but a very sad and pathetic version of him living in Transylvania, rotting away because he needs virgin blood, and he's just drank through all of it where he lives, and there's nothing left. In a desperate attempt to save his life, his servant brings him to Italy, where there is a promise of a lot of virgins due to a lot of religious people around, and Udo Kier starts biting and drinking his way through a family that is desperate to marry off their daughters to a rich suitor. But he discovers the girls may not be as pure as he expected.
The blood of these whores is killing me.
I checked this movie out on Severance, kind of recently released Blu-ray, and I love Dracula movies. In fact, Dracula is my personal favorite fictional character of all time. And I watched this leading up to my top 15 Dracula movies video that I put out last month, and my gosh, I loved it so much. It's been a while since I watched a horror movie that was so sick and twisted and disturbing. Like, I was just grossed out by this movie, whether it be the really extreme and often disturbing sexuality of it, or the blood drinking scenes in which Udo Kier just has blood gushing out of his mouth, and when he discovers it's not the pure blood that he needs, he just starts convulsing and writhing on the floor. It's truly one of the most bizarre performances I have ever seen in my life. I can't say Udo Kier is one of my absolute favorite cinematic Draculas, but I can say he's the weirdest one, and I certainly respect that. This movie's whole angle of treating vampirism as disease, virgin blood as an antidote, I thought was really interesting. And despite the fact that it's so messed up and gross, it is very technically well made. A beautiful looking movie with a gorgeous score. I thought the score for this film, the music was just stunning. And it's just interesting to watch a movie that is so messed up, but also just so technically well made, because I feel like those two things don't go together a whole lot. Kicking off the top 5 is my favorite Western that I saw this year. That is Buck and the Preacher from 1972. Directed by Sidney Poitier, this film also stars that iconic actor as Buck, a man back in the Old West whose job is to escort recently freed slaves after the Civil War into the North. Because while these formerly enslaved people have technically won their freedom, their former owners are often not willing to comply with the law in that way, and it's dangerous for them to actually become free. As Buck is taking them on this epic journey, he runs into the Preacher, a weird criminal who pretends to be a reverend, played by Harry Belafonte in one of my favorite performances I saw all year. This is an incredibly fun, exciting, entertaining action-adventure Western with two of the best lead performances. I checked this movie out on Criterion's Blu-ray release, and Sidney Poitier is just a perfect stoic Western hero. There's nothing terribly unique about him, but when it comes to that archetype, he just fits it to a T. But it's Harry Belafonte's performance that rocketed this movie into the stratosphere for me. I think it's one of the best weirdo supporting performances I've ever seen, up there with Johnny Depp as Jack Sparrow, or heck, even Heath Ledger as the Joker. He is so unrecognizable, weird, gross, and funny in this movie. I just loved him so much. The movie's action is really good. It's very confidently directed by Sidney Poitier in his directorial debut, although not terribly stylishly directed, but the movie doesn't need that. But other than Belafonte's performance, it's really just the fact that this is such a fascinating story about the Old West, about what people actually went through back in this time period that's not often told in Westerns. In fact, I've never seen this story told in a Western before, and that's a shame because clearly this stuff happened for a certain group of people in the Old West. It was very prevalent to their history, and it should be told more often, but I'm glad it was so well told in Buck and the Preacher. At number 4 is a Mexican horror film, Black Pit of Dr. M from 1959. This film is about two doctors. They make a pact that whoever dies first will go into the afterlife, but then has to come back and tell the other one how to beat death, how to return to life. One of them does die, and the other one's like, hey, don't forget our pact. And he doesn't, because he comes back as a ghost and says, hey, I figured out the secret. I can do this for you, but it's going to be horrible. You are not going to like this process. But the guy says, no, it's fine. I want to beat death. I want to be immortal, so do it. And throughout the course of the movie, you watch all of these bizarre events all come together to create this horrible process of a man beating death. I checked this movie out on Indicator's Mexico Macabre box set. This is actually my favorite Blu-ray release of the year. And of course, my favorite movie in there was Black Pit of Dr. M. And while I love a lot of gothic horror films from this period, a lot of them rely so much on atmosphere and don't actually have great characters or story, but this one really does. I thought the script was phenomenal. Just watching all of these events fall into place perfectly to create this event for this doctor is so interesting. The movie also has a beautiful female lead who comes in who is the deceased doctor's daughter, and the now alive doctor who's trying to become immortal becomes obsessed with her. And I loved her in this movie. She was just a great sympathetic lead. This film still does have the gothic atmosphere. It's just out of this world great with the graveyards and the fog and the castles. The movie looks incredible. And by the end of the movie, you do get sort of a monster with a brilliant performance playing him that's really scary. Black Pit of Dr. M is a gothic black and white horror film that's just a cut above most of its contemporaries. My number 3 is such a shock to me. This is an 80s teen movie thriller that was miles better than I ever expected it to be. That is The New Kids from 1985. This film was about a couple of teenagers who tragically lose their parents in a car accident. They therefore go to live with their aunt and uncle out in the country, the kind of lifestyle they're not used to. But they earn the wrath of a local gang led up by James Spader when the teenage girl, played by Lori Loughlin, does not want to date any of them as they want to. This feud between the siblings and this gang escalates and escalates to a way bigger point than I ever expected the movie to go. By the end, the movie is so over the top and crazy and definitely tips on into the horror genre in a way I never expected. I checked out The New Kids on this retro VHS slipcover edition, Mill Creek Blu-ray, and wow, this movie is so much fun. And that's really the main reason it's on the list. I had an absolute blast watching this movie. Now, it's directed by Sean Cunningham, who actually directed the original Friday the 13th. And I've always liked that movie, but I do think it's one of the more lackluster Friday the 13th movies in terms of how it's directed. And I'm just blown away by how much better this movie is on every level. Now, I really liked our two lead teenagers, but man, James Spader's just sinister, charismatic performance as this despicable, hateable villain is so good. Definitely the standout of the movie. The movie also has an amusement park atmosphere, which I really enjoyed. And when it gets to the final battle at the end, I couldn't believe how far the movie was going, how it was taking this premise and running with it to the extremes. The New Kids is a blast. So much fun, and that's why it comes in at number 3. My number 2 is another 80s movie that I know I'm overrating. I know a lot of people will not connect to this movie on the level that I did. I almost can't explain it, but I'm gonna do my best. My number 2 is Secret Admirer from 1985. This movie stars C. Thomas Howell as a high school teenager who gets an anonymous love letter. His friends convince him that maybe it's the most beautiful girl in school who he's always had a crush on, Kelly Preston, and therefore he gets the confidence to try to go after her. Meanwhile, we start to realize it's possible this letter was actually written by his best friend, played by Lori Loughlin. And through a series of coincidences, the letter itself starts to fall into the hands of different members of the kid's parents, and that starts a lot of drama among them, including the possibility of affairs and even more wackiness. I checked this movie out on Tubi, but then I immediately bought the recently released Kino Lorber Blu-ray, which I've got right here. So happy to have this movie, and it looks so good on Blu-ray. I like 80s teen movies, but there's honestly a lot of classics in the genre that I don't really connect with, and I think at this point, this is my second favorite 80s teen comedy, right behind Valley Girl. I loved the leads in this film, like C. Thomas Howell and Lori Loughlin, they're just great, but Kelly Preston is luminous in this movie, and because of this film and some other stuff I saw, she's really become like one of my favorite actresses. I just think she's wildly underrated, and rest in peace to her, by the way. She recently passed away. Very, very sad. We lost her way too soon. The movie is funny. It is sweet and romantic. And the stuff with the parents as they start to discover the letter, is honestly even better than the stuff with the teenagers. And how many teen movies can you really say about that? Also, Corey Haim is the little brother in this movie. Really cool to see him. The movie is rated R, so it's got an edge to it that it definitely wouldn't have had if it even came out 10 years later, much less today. This movie is just probably the most fun time I had watching a movie this year. I love it. But while I absolutely love the comedy genre, my favorite genre is horror. And my number one is the scariest movie that I saw in 2023, and that is Ghostwatch from 1992. Ghostwatch is essentially a mockumentary which posits itself as a live broadcast on the BBC on Halloween night, in which a news crew is going into a supposedly haunted house. A mother and her kids claim that they have had horrific ghostly experiences in this house, and the news crew goes in to investigate. I checked this movie out on streaming, but this is another one that I bought the Blu-ray right away from One on One Films because I loved this movie so much. I thought it was really scary, and I ended up putting it very high on my top 20 haunted house movies video that I put out recently, and I caught a little bit of pushback off of that. Some people even telling me it's not even a movie, and I so disagree with that. Just because it's a mockumentary and it premiered on television does not mean it's not a movie. Like, this is not a mini series. It's very much movie length. I just thought it was incredible, really scary. And I've talked about this movie so much recently. I'm trying to find something to say about it that I haven't said yet. And I will say this movie makes a very wise decision in that by the end of the first act, maybe by the halfway point, the movie gives you a logical, real life explanation for the ghostly exploits, which then put the characters somewhat at ease. But then it becomes clear that that's not all that's going on, and there actually is a ghost there, which I think ramps up the scare factor. As if you're wondering if there's not really a ghost, the movie puts that away, and then you are just left with Pipes, who is the ghost of this movie. And I love that they give him the name Pipes, and how they do that. They really build up the legend of this ghost in such a great way that I feel like he's become a horror icon, even though he is an almost totally unseen ghost in this film. I'm a huge horror fan. I love horror movies, but I am scared by horror movies so incredibly rarely. It almost never happens anymore. And that's not me bragging about how brave I am. That's me rather talking about how sadly desensitized I have made myself. But I don't even really care that horror movies don't scare me that much, because that's not the main reason I go to horror movies. I love them despite not being scared. But when one scares me, it's a really, really special experience that I honestly treasure. And Ghostwatch gave that to me. So that's my list, but please let me know down in the comments below, what were your favorite first time watches of 2023? And if you're curious about more of my thoughts about the movies I watched last year, I did a wrap up video about my watch list of every single month. You can check out the playlist right over here. Give a like if you enjoyed this video, and a subscribe for more videos like this. Thank you so much for watching. With all that said, don't forget to take some time to enjoy yourself today, and have a very, very happy new year. And I'll see you next time.